Number 12. The Great Western Railway 3800 County Class tender engines and 2221 Class branch line tank engines. These two classes of Great Western steam engines go together on my list because they are both basically a different version of each other. The 3800 Class 440 tender engines, also known as the County Class, were designed by George Jackson Churchward, with a total of 40 built at Swindon Works between 1904 and 1912. The Counties were also the final class of 440s to be built for the Great Western, as well as the most modern, with their frames built on the inside and cylinders on the outside, rather than the other way around like on all other previous classes of GWR standard gauge 440s. Churchward had designed the Counties to basically be a smaller version of his 2900 same class 460 10-wheelers, as they were built with the same diameter driving wheels, cylinders, and valve gear as the Saints. The Counties even had the same amount of tractive effort as the Saints, making them the most powerful 440s in Great Britain. The reason for this was so they could work cross-country passenger trains on the Shrewsbury and Hereford line, which was jointly owned by the GWR and the London and North Western Railway. 460 10-wheelers were strictly forbidden on that line, so therefore the County 440s seemed to be the perfect locomotives for the job, as they were small, yet powerful enough to handle the trains on the line. Unfortunately, while the Counties were regarded as the most powerful 440s in the United Kingdom, this actually proved to be their downfall. They were shown to be too powerful for their chassis size and short wheelbase, as this caused them to become unstable and prone to rough riding when up to speed. Around the same time the County 440s were being built, Churchward had also introduced the 2221 Class 442 Atlantic type tank engines, also nicknamed the County Tanks, with 30 built between 1905 and 1912 at Swindon. They were effectively the tank engine version of the 3800 class, the only differences being that they were built with a smaller boiler, as well as side tanks, a rear coal bunker and enclosed cab, and a pair of trailing wheels. They were built to replace the William Dean designed 3600 Birdcage Class 242 tank engines, built back between 1900 and 1903, and were put to use on suburban passenger trains to and from London. However, just like their tender-wearing counterparts, they too were prone to rough riding when up to speed, due to their short wheelbase and large external cylinders. In the end, both the County 440 tender engines and County Tank 442 tank engines were considered Churchward's least successful designs. Withdrawal for both versions of these engines took place between 1930 and 1934, then all were scrapped. But they won't remain gone for too much longer. Or at least not the County 440s. Today, a new build of the next County 440, number 3840, County of Montgomery, is currently taking place. The project is being done by the Churchward County Trust, based at the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway. The new build Churchward County is being built using a combination of newly made components and ones recycled from other engines that once resided at the legendary Wooden Brothers scrapyard on Barry Island, where so many steam engines that have been withdrawn from British Railways were then later on purchased for preservation. At the time of this video, quite a bit of progress has been done on the new Churchward County 440. The main frame assembly has been completed, its two first driving wheels have been cast, and the engine's new boiler, tender chassis, and various other components have been delivered from the Didcot Railway Centre. Hopefully they'll be able to find a solution to its instability when up to speed before the engine is completed. Number 11. The Baltimore and Ohio EM1s. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was the first official railroad to be incorporated in the United States on July 4, 1828. It was best known for having some impressive motor power, such as their Class P or President Class 462 Pacifics, their Class V2 464 Hudson No. 2 Lord Baltimore, and their Class N1 Duplex 4444. It was also best known for its unique collection of historic 19th century-era railroad equipment, which can be seen today at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. These include the 1863-built 460 10-wheeler No. 147, the Thatcher Perkins, the 1875 build 260 Mogul No. 600, the J.C. Davis, and the 1856 build 440 American No. 25, the William Mason. The largest and most powerful steam engines built for the Baltimore and Ohio were the Class EM1 2884s, with 30 built by Baldwin Locomotive Works from 1944 to the end of the Second World War, numbered 7600 to 7629, later renumbered 650 to 679. These giants of the B&O were built primarily for heavy freight service, but these engines were also built with roller bearings, which helped them to prove to be just as effective at pulling fast mail and express passenger trains. They originally saw work on the Cumberland Division, which was home to the infamous Sand Patch and 17-mile grades, but when the Diesels took over that territory, they were then transferred over to the Pittsburgh Division. In 1957, the Baltimore and Ohio began scrapping their EM1s. And by 1960, all of them were no more. Or were they? This image from a post on the Baltimore and Ohio Facebook fan page shows a page from an old B&O Railroad Museum booklet from the late 50s and early 60s, which shows that one of their intended exhibits was to be an EM1. The following pictures from that same post show EM1 number 659 placed in dead storage, awaiting the chance to be placed on stag display. Tragically, however, there was possibly a mix-up in communication regarding the locomotive status, so the last surviving EM1 didn't live to see preservation, being cut up for scrap in 1961. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum did come pretty close, but unfortunately just not close enough to save one of these giants of the B&O. Yeah, you thought I was gonna go for that close but no cigar bit like Christopher Kovacs and Jim Vanderkolk did in their top 15 and top 20 extinct steam locomotives. They say 3 times a charm, but I felt that wouldn't be the case this time. Number 10. The London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway L-Class Baltic tank engines. When it comes to large engines built for express passenger service in the United Kingdom, the largest they were able to get without them exceeding the British loading gauge were those of the 462 Pacific-type wheel arrangement. The majority of 462 Pacifics came out during the days of the Big Four. Well, mainly for the LNER, LMS, and Southern, and even into the days of British Railways, before steam came to an end during the late 60s. However, during the years prior to the Grouping Act in 1923, most express trains were powered by either 440s, 460 10-wheelers, or 442 Atlantics. Some of the largest engines to be built for express passenger trains in the UK during the days of pre-grouping were the 464 Baltic tank engines, Baltic being the European name for locomotives with a 464 wheel arrangement, named after the Baltic Sea. The Baltic tank engines were the most common steam engines with a 464 wheel arrangement to operate in Great Britain, as they were practically the only kind of engines with that wheel arrangement that could fit the British loading gauge. In fact, there was only one 464 tender engine ever to be built in the UK, that being Sir Nigel Gresley's experimental LNER Class W1 number 10,000, nicknamed the Hush Hush, built back in 1929. One particular class of Baltic tank engines that comes to my mind is the London, Brighton, and South Coast Railways L-Class, nicknamed the Brighton Baltics, designed by L.B. Billington for express passenger services. Only 7 members of the class were built at the LBSCR's works at Brighton, hence the nickname, with the first 2 built in 1914 and the remaining 5 between 1921 and 1922, their construction being delayed due to the First World War. When the 2 first members of the class, number 327, named Charles C. McCrae, and number 328, first entered service, they were found to be unstable while traveling up to high speed, and even prone to derailing. Luckily though, the problem for these engines was much simpler than on the Great Western Counties I talked about earlier. Their reason was due to water surging around their large side tanks, even when they were just half full. The 2 464 tank engines were taken back to Brighton and rebuilt with large well tanks between their axles, and their side tanks were shortened down to hold less water than they did before, but still kept the outer shell the same as to retain their aesthetic appearance. This modification resulted in both engines having a much lower center of gravity, making them more stable while traveling at the speed, which helped the class prove to be much more successful. It wouldn't be until 1921 when the 5 final members of the class were built until 1922. They were numbered 329, named Stevenson, 330, 331, 332, and 33. Not that one either, or Tri-3 as I'm going to call it, named Remembrance. The final member of the class, number Tri-3, Remembrance, was probably the most famous, as it was named in honor of the railwaymen for the LBSER who had lost their lives during the First World War. When the London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway became merged with the other railways of southern England to become the Southern Railway in 1923, the Brighton Baltics became part of the Southern System, along with many other former LBSER engines. They continued their work on the main express passenger trains between London and Brighton until the year 1923, when the line they worked on had become electrified. They were then transferred over to Eastbourne, where they headed express trains between there and London. But when that line became planned for electrification as well, the class was once again made redundant. In 1934, Richard Monsell had decided to have all 7 Brighton Baltics rebuilt for use on express trains on the western section of the Southern Railway, and by 1936, all 7 re-emerged from Eastleigh Works as the Southern Railway's N15X class 460 10-wheelers. When the class was rebuilt, they were named, or renamed, after famous railway engineers of Great Britain, except for number 2329, Stevenson, and 2333, Remembrance. The others had become 2327, Trevithick, 2328, Hackworth, 2330, Cudworth, 2331, Beatty, and 2332, Stradley. Following their rebuild, they were based at Nine Elms, where they headed passenger services between Bournemouth and Southampton. However, in their rebuilt state, they didn't perform as well as the already existing former London and South Western Railway N15 King Arthur class 10-wheelers, so they tended to be placed on secondary services. At one time, they were even loaned to the Great Western Railway between November 1941 and July 1943 to help out on goods trains. The N15X class continued their work on secondary services on the Southern Railway, and later BR after 1948, until the mid-50s, when withdrawal for the class began in 1955. After the final one was withdrawn in July 1957, all the N15Xs, and the Brighton Baltics they once were, ceased to exist. This is one class of British steam locomotives I would like to see someone decide to do a new build project for someday in the future. Especially a replica of number Tri-3, Remembrance, like how the replica LMS Patriot number 5551, the Unknown Warrior, is currently being built. It would be pretty interesting to see one of the largest classes of tank engines to be built in the United Kingdom running again. By that I mean the size of the engines themselves. Number 9. The Illinois Central Railroad numbers 382 and 638. Old number 382 was a 460 10-wheeler built back in 1898 by the Rogers Locomotive Works in Paterson, New Jersey. It was used for both freight and passenger trains on the Illinois Central Railroad. As for number 638, it was a 280 consolidation also built by Rogers in 1893 and also saw service on the Illinois Central, being used primarily for freight service. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm mainly focusing on these two old-timers, especially since there were other locomotives like these two built for the Illinois Central, as well as other railroads around that era. Well, the reason these two go together on my list is because they were once the locomotives driven by the legendary Casey Jones. Not that Casey Jones! Not that Casey either. Getting a bit closer. There we go. The Casey Jones I'm referring to is John Luther Jones, former locomotive engineer for the Illinois Central and the most famous engineer in American railroad history. Casey was born back on March 14, 1863, in southwest Missouri. While he was still young, his family had to move out to Casey, Kentucky, so his father could find work. This was also where he would receive his famous nickname we all know him by today. While growing up, Casey became fascinated by the railroads, which was still a fast-growing industry at the time, and this led to his lifelong dream of becoming a railroad engineer, or driver for the British audiences. Casey's career with the railroads began in 1878 at the age of 15, when he got a job as a telegraph operator for the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, then eventually got promoted to brakeman, then locomotive fireman. In 1887, he switched from the Mobile in Ohio to the Illinois Central, when an outbreak of yellow fever had crippled many train crews. Casey continued to work as fireman for the Illinois Central over the next few years, until he finally reached his lifetime goal when he was promoted to engineer on February 23, 1891. Throughout his career, Casey became well known for his profession as a crack train engineer, and many regarded him as one of the best in the business. He was best known for his dedication to get his train to its destination right on time, and was never known once to fall down, or fall behind schedule. During that time, he worked mainly on freight service between Jackson, Tennessee and Water Valley, Mississippi, a run which he had become quite accustomed to since he first began work on the Illinois Central. The 638 comes into Casey's story in 1893 during the World's Columbian Exposition, aka the Chicago World's Fair. The Illinois Central was given responsibility for providing commuter service for visitors to the fairgrounds. Casey took on the task of shuttling passengers from Van Buren Street to Jackson Park during the fair, and even got to spend a nice summer there with his wife, Janie Brady Jones. It was also his first time working as an engineer on passenger trains, and he liked it. Number 638 itself was on stag display at the fair as the latest technological advancement in railroading at that time. When the fair came to a close in October later that year, the 638 was due to be sent down to Water Valley to start service, which also just so happened to be where Casey worked. Casey asked for permission to drive the engine down to Water Valley himself. When his request was approved, he drove the engine on its first 589-mile journey from Chicago, Illinois to Water Valley, Mississippi. Since then, the 638 had become Casey's pride and joy, and the two of them worked together throughout the rest of the 1890s. One little-known example of Casey's heroic instincts occurred back in 1895. As Casey's train was coming into Michigan City, Mississippi, he left the cab of his engine in charge of fellow engineer Bob Stevenson, who reduced speed so Casey could walk safely along the running board so he could oil the relief valves. He had finished well before they arrived at the station, and just as he was about to head back towards the cab, he noticed a group of kids running over the tracks in front of his train, about 60 yards ahead. All of them made it across, except for one little girl, who just froze in fear in between the rails at the side of the oncoming locomotive. Casey shouted back at Stevenson to stop the train, and yelled out to the girl to get off the tracks, almost in the same breath no less. Realizing that the girl was completely immobilized with fear, unable to move a muscle, Casey raced up to the tip of the cowcatcher, or pilot, braced himself, then reached out and pulled the little girl right off the tracks, frightened, but thankfully unharmed. This little-known event in Casey's life was later parodied in one scene of Walt Disney's 1950 animated theatrical short, The Brave Engineer. However, for that scene, the little girl was replaced by a damsel in distress, who had been tied to the railroad tracks by an old-timey dastardly villain.
My hero! Curses! Foiled again!
Back to the story, in February 1900, Casey was then transferred to Memphis, Tennessee, to work on passenger trains between there and Canton, Mississippi. This is when he became acquainted with old number 382. The passenger run between Memphis and Canton was part of a 4-train service between Chicago, Illinois and New Orleans, Louisiana, known as the Cannonball Express, which offered the fastest schedules in U.S. railroad history. Some veteran railroad engineers doubted the times could be met, and some even ended up quitting because of it, but Casey saw it as a challenge. Probably Casey Jones' most famous run is also his very last. On April 29, 1900, Casey and his fireman, Simeon T. Webb, nicknamed Sim, had arrived back in Memphis from another run from Canton around 9 o'clock at night. Just as they were planning on heading home for the night, Casey was asked to take the southbound Cannonball back down to Canton, as the engineer that was supposed to take it that night had fallen sick. So Casey volunteered to take his place on the Cannonball, with number 382 as his locomotive. The Cannonball was meant to leave at 11:35 p.m., but ended up departing at 12:50 a.m., 75 minutes, or an hour and 15 minutes to be precise, behind schedule, due to the late arrival of another train, so Casey had to push number 382 up to high speed in order to make up for lost time. By the time Casey had raced through Grenada, Mississippi, he was only 40 minutes behind schedule and continued to pick up speed. He raced through Winona, then Durant, continuing to make up lost time while traveling up to high speed. By the time he pulled out of Goodman after allowing a northbound train to pass, he was only 5 minutes behind schedule, and it seemed like he would be able to arrive in Canton right on time. However, little did he realize the danger just before his final destination that laid up ahead. Up ahead at Vaughn, Mississippi, 2 trains, a long northbound freight and a double-headed southbound freight, were trying to maneuver themselves into a siding in order to allow the southbound Cannonball to race through. But as they were entering the siding, an air hose on the 4th car back from the engine on the northbound freight had ruptured, locking the train's brakes hard on and making it, and the double-headed southbound freight, unable to move. This left the caboose and 3 cars of the southbound freight stalled on the main line, right in the path of the Cannonball and Casey. Casey's train was rapidly approaching Vaughn up to 75 miles per hour, when Sim Webb saw the red lights from the caboose of the stalled southbound freight in front of them and warned Casey of the danger ahead. Knowing he may not be able to stop in time, Casey told his fireman to jump from the cab. Then he grabbed the whistle cord, closed the throttle, and slammed on the brakes. But it wouldn't be enough to prevent disaster. Number 382 crashed into the back of the stalled freight, smashing through the caboose and a couple more cars before leaving the rails and landing on the ground. Casey was killed upon impact. Amazingly, Casey had managed to slow his train down from 75 to 35 miles per hour just before the crash, and he was only 2 minutes behind schedule by the time of the wreck. Also, because he remained in the cab of number 382 to keep the brakes applied and slow his train down, he managed to save all of his passengers on board from death and serious injury, thus regarding him as a hero. The story of Casey Jones has become a great legend in American folklore, made possible by a famous railroad song written in dedication to him, known to everyone as the Ballad of Casey Jones. Since then, Casey's legend has been depicted in many ways in different forms of media, such as the 1950 Disney animated short The Brave Engineer mentioned earlier, and the 1957 Western TV show starring Alan Hale Jr. as Casey Jones, and the famous movie star steam locomotive itself, Sierra Railway No. 3, as the Cannonball locomotive. Speaking of the Cannonball, after the wreck in 1900, number 382 was repaired to exactly how it was when it was first built by Rogers back in 1898, and soon returned to service. However, it was believed that old 382 had become jinxed after the wreck of the Cannonball, as bad luck seemed to follow it wherever it went, being involved in a few more wrecks, and even being renumbered 3 times. The engine was finally retired from service in July 1935, then scrapped. Coincidentally, old number 382 was 37 years old by the time it was scrapped, the same age Casey Jones was when he perished on the night of his last run back in 1900. As for Casey's beloved number 638, it continued to work for the Illinois Central until 1921, when it was sold to the Mexican government. It continued to run in service down in Mexico up into the 1940s, then was most likely scrapped sometime afterwards. And if you're wondering about that other engine, number 382, at the Casey Jones Village in Jackson, Tennessee, it is not the actual Illinois Central number 382. The engine on display there is actually the former Clinchfield Railroad number 99, another 460 10-wheeler built by Baldwin back in 1905 and bared a very close resemblance to old number 382. So when it was donated to the museum back in 1956, it was cosmetically restored to look as close to the 382 as possible. However, there is another locomotive that does bear a pretty close resemblance to old number 382. In fact, it's not even an actual locomotive. It is actually one of the 2 full-scale mock-up locomotives that were built for the 2013 Disney film The Lone Ranger. It was the locomotive that appeared in the beginning of the film, called John's Train, then was cosmetically modified into the Constitution locomotive seen throughout the rest of the film. After production for the Lone Ranger had finished, both mock-up locomotives, the other being the 440 American Jupiter locomotive, were donated to the Fillmore and Western Railway in Fillmore, California, where it was placed in dead storage or placed on static display, as well as being used for a few other productions, from commercials to TV shows and other films, until the Fillmore and Western finally closed down for good in mid-2021, and much of its equipment was sold off. It's currently unknown where the Constitution prop locomotive is now. However, the Jupiter prop locomotive, as well as a few other movie prop railroad cars, went to the Volo Museum in Volo, Illinois, where they plan to open up a new part of the museum known as the Chuggin' Along Train Tour and Museum in either late spring or summer later this year. Well, wherever the Constitution locomotive is now, if anyone ever decides to make a true-to-life production on the story of Casey Jones, it would definitely be the perfect locomotive to use for the role of old number 382. It would need to have a few modifications done to it, such as its firebox, crossheads, cab roof, and various other parts, to make it look as close to the actual 382 as possible. But personally, I think I would like it better if anyone ever decides to have two full-scale operational replicas of both the 382 and 638, or at least just the 382, built one day. It would definitely serve as a good tribute to the American railroad legend that is Casey Jones.